folks, thanks for coming to today's Brownbag. Let me tell you about a few things that we have going on later in the week. We've actually got several films. We're going to be showing the first of our Turkish films this semester on Thursday. That'll be at 7 here in Bailey Hall in 318. It's called The Girl with the Red Scarf, and if you're looking for other information on these films, we have it either on this table or just outside on the billboard or the corkboard out there. And then on Friday, we're showing a couple of them. We're showing one actually up at Edwards campus, Rusalichka the Mermaid, and that's going to be from 6 to 8:30 in Rainier Hall in 150. And then there's a Polish film that we're going to be showing, again from 7 to 9. It's called In the Name Of. And I won't try to pronounce the Polish name, it's very short. Our speaker today is Maria Louise LaRue. She is a professor in the School of Architecture, specializes in social and cultural aspects of architecture and urban design, and specifically in Baltic, East European, and Russian architecture and culture. She's been teaching a course for several years now.
I've taught it 3 times.
3 times. On the Socialist City, and it's a team-taught course.
No, that's not mine.
Okay, all right.
I was teaching with Nathan a course on the city.
Okay.
For a couple of graduate students.
This I know, that the first crop that we had of our Reese students who took the course, it got rave reviews. So I've been asking her to come in and give us just a taste of the course, and that's what you're going to hear today.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I proposed a roundtable for the Philadelphia ACES conference in November on teaching the Socialist City. And when Bart approached me in December and said, "Want to do something?" So that's why I did this. It's a little bit difficult because I'm not going to actually give you a course. I'm sort of giving you sort of the rationale behind the idea of the Socialist City. And I taught it 3 times, but none of the 3 times were the same. But what I handed out to you was I taught it in 2010, 2012, and 2013. And so what you have there is a 2012 and 2013 syllabi. And between those, I switched it from being strictly the socialist cities to the 20th century city, capitalist, socialist, modern. Capitalist, socialist, modern. And it was a little, the time that I taught it with all the Reese students and PhD students in geography and history, I had undergraduate architecture students. It was kind of it was great. The discussions were fantastic. I had them do the readings and do a reading response and then come up with 2 questions and submit this early. And then I gathered up all the questions, usually with some illustrating images, and then handed those up at the beginning of class. And so then we had these sort of ready-made discussion questions for the class, which worked really well for my architecture students who were pretty unfamiliar with the region. And then the graduate and the Reese students basically gave a history of the Soviet Union from their point of view. It was really interesting to see how that worked. In a few years ago, it must have been a little while ago, 2009 maybe, I was on a panel about the Socialist City in ACES, and I asked Nathan Wood to be a respondent, and he, due diligence, went around and tried to find out what the heck a Socialist City was, and read a number of articles about it, and he said that by the end he still hadn't figured out really what a socialist city was in real terms. And it's because cities are very complex entities, and they're a process and they evolve over time. But they do have the political ideology in place does have an impact on the way the city develops. And when professors teach seminars, you know that why they're teaching is because they want to do the readings. They bring you all along for the ride. And so that's why I never teach it the same way twice, because I've already done those readings. I want to do some different kinds of things. And so I usually keep the best ones. And it's really funny because something like the Tashkent book that I first ran into, I think 2010, it just came out right before the class started, so I introduced that. And my students that year seemed to enjoy the Tashkent book, but when I taught it in 2012, oh my God, I get complaints from the graduate students about the attitude of the author, and they thought he was disdainful of the Tashkent population, and there was some mention about the Romas, and it was really, so it's very interesting to see the different reactions to it. I've also used Timothy Colton's book on Moscow. I think I only did it once. It's a little dry, and it's more from an administrative governance point of view rather than from the architecture side. And I'm interested really in looking at the city from all kinds of different points of view, not simply as an architectural, as a physical, morphological entity. And so I usually bring poetry, we look at films, we look at maps, and I found that not as enough that I did that, because I think it's a good way of looking at the physical and trying to read a map and understanding it from a graphic point of view and an ideological point of view that's represented. So this was Mayakovsky's poem about the construction of these cities, and very typical. And the thing is, a lot of the people that were involved in the Soviet Union in the 20s and up to the early 30s were from the West. They were Germans who were escaping the oppression of the Socialist, National Socialist Party in the early 30s, Hans May. And they were socialist leaning, and except for Le Corbusier, who he just wants to build, and he had worked with the industrialists, and so he thought maybe working with the communists in Russia would be more effective. He'd maybe get more things built, but of course that didn't happen. And so the trend of modern architecture and modern urban planning, there was an overlap between what was modern and what was Soviet, and the split occurred in 1932-33 with the Palace of the Soviet design, when the shift in architecture and design went from being a modern constructivist mode to more of a classical architecture. And so the later development in the Soviet Union seems to have sort of like faltered in a sense, but it really didn't. It's just it was dressed in a different kind of clothes than the Western buildings, but it was actually very similar right up through the early period. So one of the starting points I have in the class is we read a little bit of Lefebvre's The Production of Space, in which he says that any social existence aspiring or claiming to be real but failing to produce its own space would be a strange entity, a very peculiar kind of abstraction, unable to escape from the ideological or even the cultural realm. So this idea that that ideologies and particularly political points of view do create a space that's different from others. It distinguishes itself in different ways. It would fall at the level of folklore and sooner or later disappear altogether, thereby immediately losing its identity, its denomination, and its feeble degree of reality. And he was writing this in the late 60s, so when the Soviet Union was still very much alive. This suggests a possible criteria for distinguishing between ideology and practice, as well as between ideology and knowledge, or otherwise stated, for distinguishing between the lived on the one hand and the perceived and the conceived on the other, and for discerning their interrelationship, their oppositions and dispositions, and what they reveal versus what they conceal. So this idea of a city being, it's imagined by the architects, it's conceived that way, and by the designers, and it's built, but people actually experience and perceive it, obviously, from their individual points of view, and understand it on many different levels. And trying to get at that in a course where, for architects, if we give them more than 30 pages of reading, they just feel totally oppressed. So it's a little bit hard to do that. We read, my second year, I guess, we read Magnetic Mountain, Magnetodox by Steve Kotkin. And I know that in the history program, they assigned that for a week's reading. We read it a chapter at a time. But I think that actually the historians in the room who had actually read it before, I think they had actually really read it this time instead of breezing through it really fast. And I know I enjoyed it a lot more because I had read it at Berkeley, and it was one of those things where you read it in a week. And so I can't really see my slides. So. Okay, so the way I have the class divided, we look at the morphology, that means the way the shape, the patterns of it, the way the street networks work, this is sort of the fine-grained features of the city from a physical point of view. And we look at its physiology, how the city functions, how people get around in it, how the relationship between work and leisure and living, and the ideology, what are the power relationships in it, who gets to be in #1 spot of the city, who has the best access, who has the best stores, that kind of thing. And also the perception, the experience of the city, how it's perceived, represented, produced, and reproduced, these experiences and feelings. And this is, I wrote this before I ever put anything together, and it's still, my syllabus is, you can see, it's still not perfect. I got a few complaints actually, that they found the second half of the semester reading's not as interesting as the first half, and I still have to fix that. But since, in the last 2 years, this is Brigitte Lenormand designing Tito's Capital about Yugoslavia, and there are at least a half-dozen books by design-oriented people like me that have been published recently on socialist cities. And so I think that the next go-round, I'm hoping to teach it next fall. Although if the state cuts our budget more than 3%, we're going to, maybe not going to be able to teach unless I teach it as an overage. But I'm hoping that I can, because I can't do 2 courses and a studio. All right. So one of the things, though, about looking at the form of a city, for instance, the grid. The grid is a fairly universal application, and it means different things in different contexts. So you can't just look at the form of something, you have to look at how people understand the form. So in China, this was the capital city at the time, and the palaces in the back at the north of the city, in this feng shui way of keeping the evil spirits from the north from coming into the city. And how far you can penetrate into the grid depends on your position in the city. As opposed to, this is William Penn's map of Philadelphia, which is a grid as well. You have the 4 parks, 3 of which still exist. And it has, in American terminology, it tends to be seen as a democratic way of doing it. Everyone has equal access to different areas and can penetrate. But as you can see, it actually doesn't mean that, depending on where the guards are, and also in the Chinese situation, the east-west movement. So if you can move along the east-west path, you can move along the entire east-west path, but you're limited to how far north you can penetrate into the city. So it's important to look at multiple layers and from different points of view. And the first time I taught it, I used quite a few, 3 or 4 readings from people that had written about the socialist city in the 60s and 70s. Because it's kind of an interesting point of view, discussing, it's from a whole different mentality than it is for people writing about it now, sort of looking back into the past. But they tend to be a little bit dry and technical, so the students don't like them as well. Okay, really, one of the things, the Soviet idea about the city, obviously right after the revolution, this map is from 1918, they had a lot of other things on their mind besides what the new society would look like. But young architects at the time, and the profession of architecture included the field of urban design and planning way up until, even in the United States, until the 50s. So architects tended to do this work, so the city tended to be seen as a work of art rather than as a functioning place. So the way the plan's appearance and the spatial relationships and the types of footprints and the types of streets that were created were not so much done from a functional point of view, even though architects might think they were. They were really done for ways of creating a beautiful city is what the intention was. And one of the problems, and this is a universal at the time, the discussion, especially at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, was the cities had grown huge, London, Paris, Moscow, Berlin especially, and that they were very poor conditions to live in for the people, and so there were a lot of discussions on how you improve it. And the young architects, the OSA, the Organization of Contemporary Architects, OSA as they're called, and there was ASNOVA, which is another acronym for, there was a more technical group. Among them, there were people that were called the urbanists and the disurbanists. The urbanists thought that cities could be dense and clustered together. They didn't believe in dismembering Moscow, for instance. But the Deservinists wanted to completely allow the large cities to become smaller, become more green, and then spread out in a linear fashion across the landscape. And then each it's sort of like satellite cities that were in a linear form. And the architecture at the time in the 20s, it was not very much that was built, but what was built, such as this Konstantin Melnikov, this is the Soviet pavilion in France, in Paris, in the 1920s, 1925, and it had its characteristic where they were playing with form, playing with materials, but in the Soviet Union they were very restricted. They really didn't have concrete to speak of. I don't know if I included a picture of a building under construction, but they didn't have they didn't really even have pulleys and lifts and crane type things, so they'd build these long wooden ramps to push wheelbarrows full of materials up in order to construct it. So the type of architecture they were designing was in conflict with the technical means that they had at hand to actually be able to produce it. And so this is a picture, this is the first communal house that was designed and built, and you can see Shushkov's tower, or radio tower, that was built in 1926, which was actually kind of a feat of engineering that they were able to construct that. And I could have shown you Tatlin's tower. You're probably much more familiar with that, the third what they call that, the National meeting. And it's that really leaning tower that was never built, actually, but they were models of it. And so the type of planning that was going on, and the plans were really pretty poor condition, so I don't really think I showed any. But they basically just sort of these linear things were very repetitive. And of course, there's no way that would be built like that. I mean, you have a city like 100 miles long, basically, with the housing sort of dispersed, and then the industry would be on the downwind side of the linear city. But of course, when things were actually built, as in Magnitogorsk, when the architects were still working on the plans, and they were already digging and locating the factory, and it ended up that, of course, there was next to the river there, and the plan was to put the housing on the east side of the river, and then they started building it on the west, and then the factory, and then they realized that it was downwind from the factory, so all the smoke was going to the residential areas. And so, there were a lot of planning going on, but what was actually built was kind of a mess in a lot of places. And this is this is a text from El Lissitzky, who wrote during this period, and talks about our new social order is being built in an agricultural country. We have inherited cities from Moscow to Samarkand, from Novosibirsk to Alma-Ata, and belong to quite different stages of civilization. In these cities, buildings that correspond to a feudal civilization must now be put to entirely new uses. During the week, the streets and squares of these cities must carry traffic, bowing in a totally new rhythm. On holidays, they must offer new opportunities. Previously, nobody had time for these problems of basic city planning. Our first need was offices for our centralized industry, space for the administrative buildings of the newest republic, etc., etc. And then I'll have another quote in the next page. So this is actually Moscow, showing here, and the river, and basically the intention. This is the zoo. The idea with that, the buildings would be repaired, they'd be allowed to fall into ruin, and they'd be replaced with green areas. The housing would be along these are the pathways where the housing would be located. The little dots you see are the houses. And then the green would encircle Moscow, and then the industry would occur on the other side of this green space. And then this is Ernst May. He's a German architect who went to Germany, went to Russia in 1930, and this was his plan for Moscow. The checkered area is for industry. These dots, this is for housing. And the black areas, that's for the center. And so this represents a network idea of the city collective. So where the residential areas would be, that would be denser with people, but then there'd be these pathways that connect to industry and then to the center. And then these similar, this is from the same journal, this is Hannes Meyer. He was one of the heads of the Bauhaus, which was a school in Germany that was set up to create modern architecture. And it was intended to, modern architecture, modern design. And actually, they didn't actually teach architecture, they taught fabric design, they taught object design, they taught two-dimensional and three-dimensional design. And all of these things put together is how you would create architecture from all of these different things. And the aesthetic was supposed to be a machine aesthetic, so these products would be mass-produced and distributed. And it was it lasted from, it was started off in Weimar, and then it was moved to senior moment here.
Berlin?
It ended in Berlin. It was a little town, sort of not far from Hamburg.
In Kiel?
No. It'll come to me. One of those things, if I stop to think about it, I have to say, Mary had a little lamb. Then it pops into my head. Dessau. Oh, it was in Dessau. I don't know why that works, but if you do a little rhyme and not think about it for a second, it'll work. Usually, in my head, it just pops right in. Okay, so he brought, so the Bauhaus was closed down because Hitler didn't like modern architecture. He wanted the traditional, building. And so these German architects went to Russia. And actually, I think Ernst May got stuck there for a while. It was hard for him to leave because there was no place for him to go once the National Socialists really took over in Germany. And so these Bauhaus ideas got mixed in with the OSA, the Organization of Contemporary Architects in the Soviet Union. And Le Corbusier, who's a very well-known Western architect, he's kind of the godfather of modern architecture in a sense. My particular professor at McGill University was a structural rationalist who had actually worked with Le Corbusier at Auguste Perret's office in France back in the, I don't know when that would have been, I think the 40s, 50s, maybe, I don't know. But anyway, so he didn't have a lot of respect for Le Corbusier, so I'm one of the few architects in my generation who doesn't worship the ground Le Corbusier walks on. But he had a really big influence on architecture. And this is another quote from Lazitsky. The old monumental facades have been transformed into a series of horizontal bands of concrete and glass. The only rhythmical element is the metal window frames. In each building there are points from which it is possible to experience a new perception of space, and all this belongs to the past. Buildings continue to form part of a continuous street front, as if private ownership of individual lots were still the rule. This idea of banded windows, of structure separated from the facade, and the plan independent of the function, so the structural system and the plan really didn't have a lot in common. Those were principles of architecture that were defined by Le Corbusier in what's called CIAM, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, CIAM. And they had these meetings yearly or bi-yearly, all over the place. The Athens Charter was one that defined the urban relationship between the modern architecture and the city. And it was 1922, and so Le Corbusier had this idea that that you couldn't have a modern life in an old city, and so he proposed this idea that was called the plan voisin, which means the neighbor plan in French, except voisin was actually the name of the industrialist who promoted it. It had nothing to do with neighborhoods. But and so some people don't know French, or who know French but don't know that, keep calling it the neighbor plan, but it's not the neighbor plan, it's the plan voisin. Anyways, so that was for 3 million people. He basically laid it over Paris, you know, and you can see that there's the Haussmann Boulevard's coming in, and then there's this sea of towers going across the landscape. Oh, there it is. But this was a later plan. This is a plan he proposed for Moscow. When he was in Russia in 1930s, he was asked to, you know, here was Hannes Meyer's and Ernst May's proposals for Moscow, and they asked Le Corbusier, well, what do you think should happen to Moscow? And so he came up with La Ville Radieuse, the radiant city, and as you can see, these are towers that come in, and there's a transportation line, and this diagram shows the separation, so there'd be these are car traffic, this is mass transit at the bottom, and then this is the city of the gratte-ciel, which are skyscrapers. And the first, so you have these cruciform buildings that would basically cover the landscape. And people, the tall buildings were actually, a lot of people misunderstand, he didn't intend those for housing, and he definitely didn't intend them for poor people. But the housing would be in these sort of lower flat block buildings, very similar to what was actually built in the Soviet Union later. And he and Moshe Ginsburg were good friends. I didn't have a lot of time to put this together. We've been doing a dean search in my school. But you can see they wear the same brown glasses, and they were good buddies. And Moshe Ginsburg, Dom Kommuna, which was a socialist housing project in Moscow, that was built in 1922-23. And Le Corbusier built a version of it, very similar in section, in Marseille in 1954, and gets credit for this sort of split stop thing where the elevator, where the corridor is every 3 stories in the unit, so you either come in at the 2nd floor and go down, or you come in at the 1st floor and go up, depending on the configuration. And it's called a skip stop, so that way the elevator only stops every 3rd floor rather than every floor. It's less expensive and actually has the advantage for most people that you get a little walking out of most people, so that way, but a lot of people hate it. And it's actually the model that was used in the housing that was built in St. Louis in the 50s called Pruitt-Igoe. I don't know if any of you have heard of that project. It lasted 12 years, and there's a famous picture of it being exploded because it was so dysfunctional. It didn't work for anyone. It was, it was called Streets in the Sky, very much the modern architectural idea. And so these every 3rd floor, and then they had these outdoor balconies. And so it's considered the death of modern architecture. When they blew out those buildings, then it's like, that's the date that marks, now we're not going to do these glass boxes for people anymore. We're going to look at a different way of doing housing. But unfortunately, they kept building those kind of projects that line our cities, and you can see them in the peripheries in Europe. But in the United States, they tend to be in the center cities, like Cabrini Green in Chicago was that type of a housing project. And then a lot of them in the Bronx in New York. So that was Le Corbusier's idea of doing it. And then this is my, Kaganovich wrote a book on the reconstruction of Moscow in 1931. And he says, so he discusses this idea about the socialist city. He says, there are at present many who decline in every possible declension the formula, we must build a socialist city. They forget one little trifle, that the cities of the USSR already are socialist cities. Our cities became socialist from the very moment of the October Revolution, when we expropriated the bourgeoisie and socialized the means of production. Naturally, it's impossible at present to foretell the forms of social life that will prevail when socialism is finally accomplished and when communism is in full swing. Indeed, it would be absolutely non-Marxian to endeavor now to determine the definite forms of the communist life of the future. Marx and Engels never attempted to define the definite social forms of the future communist society. On the contrary, they warned us against preoccupying ourselves with such matters. Their position was that the proletariat, after it had seized power, would step by step, in every process of the socialist reconstruction of society, experience the need for and create each specific new form of life. So there's this sort of tension between the point of view of the early architects and designers and people involved in the city, as well as the point of view of philosophers like Avi Lefebvre, and the practical people in Moscow or in the administration who were responsible for building. So Kaganovich was very much interested in how the city functioned, about extending the Moscow metro, putting proper canalization, sewage and water piping systems in the city, and making it so that it works. You know. And you know, unfortunately, okay, and so this was sort of the death. This was the equivalent of blowing up Pruitt-Igoe of St. Louis. This was when the winner of the Palace of Soviets competition, 1931 to 1933. There were architects from all over the world participated in this. Walter Gropius was another famous German architect who ended up coming to the United States and being the dean at Harvard. Participated, as well as Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier was very miffed that he did not win, and everyone was aghast by what won. And this, as you probably all know, this was where the what is it, Cathedral of Christ Savior was torn down, and they started building it in '37, and the steel frame was up, and then the war started, and so they ended up taking the steel frame down and reinforcing bridges, and it very famously became a swimming pool, the largest open-air swimming pool in the world, I guess, something like that. And then, of course, not too long after the Soviet Union collapsed, the people got together and rebuilt the cathedral on its former site, the way it used to be. I haven't been inside of it, but the outside looks like it used to.
Well, and then when they rebuilt it, interestingly enough, they included the inscriptions in the original old lithography.
Huh.
So, you know, they really were putting the
They
old
made
building
it just
back
the
up
way it was.
again. Except they put a parking garage underneath, which was not part of the original plan.
I'm sure. Well, I'm glad that there's practicality there.
Well, there was talk about putting a shopping mall in underneath.
Yeah, and this is the same picture in color, but you can see better the type of architecture now that was going. This is sort of Le Corbusier-esque in the sense that this was the center of Moscow, around where the cathedral was, and they were going to demolish all of the existing infrastructure and build these nice classical buildings all around, and really transform the way the city looked. And then this is the picture, it's my last picture. It's the Cathedral of Christ the Redeemer when it was taken down, and they, it says in place of the breeding of drugs or narcotics, your religion, there's going to be the tzadets of these Soviets, so the Palace of the Soviets is going to be built there. So if I had more time, I was going to show images. This I've been pretty much concentrating on Moscow, which I actually don't do in my course normally. And in my own research, I sort of stay out of Moscow. I'm much more interested in the periphery. I do work particularly in the Baltic states. And when you do that, you find out that a lot of things that Russian historians, scholars about the built environment will say doesn't actually apply to places like Estonia or the Baltic states generally. You know, it just didn't happen that way in those states. And so I find it's interesting to use it as a counterpoint to have Moscow there and what people say about it, and then show that in actuality the peripheral cities did have, especially the ones where the local architects were still practicing in it. In Tashkent it was a little bit different because they didn't really have Tashkent people designing in Central Asia. They were Russian architects who went out there, and even though they brought Russian architects to Estonia, they already had a native population of Estonian architects who were designing and working there, that had worked in the independence period, and who kept their ideas going. And even though they were censured a couple of times, they were kicked out of the Architects Association, especially Ed Darkusik, who was sort of the grandfather of there were 2 or 3 architects who had been practicing since the 20s. And they taught at the university, and so they were passing on their ideas to the younger generation. And later on, these young architects who are my age, basically, they would say that, or a little bit older than me, they would say that the Architects Association, and through that, were able to preserve the ideas from the pre-Soviet to the post-Soviet space. Okay, so